Hello, I'm Aileen Armstrong. I'm Executive Director of Strategy, Innovation and External Affairs at the SRA. And I'm joined today by Colette Comerford, who's Head of Inclusion, Diversity and Belonging at Ashurst LLP, and Megan Murray-Smith, who's from KPMG LLP UK, who's Inclusion, Diversity and Equality Manager there. So I just want to say a very warm welcome to everyone who's been able to join the webinar today. We're going to be looking at retention and progression in law firms, and we're really focusing on the retention and progression of women and of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, as these are the groups that our firm diversity data has highlighted as being underrepresented at senior levels. But I'm going to get into that detail in a moment. Before we get into our discussion today, I've got a little bit of housekeeping, and I'm also going to give you a little bit of background about the SRA and what we are doing in this area. So housekeeping first, we really do want this webinar to be interactive today. So I'll open up to questions in the second half of our discussion. But just to give you the heads up, to ask a question, you can crack on and send it through to us already through the link that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen now. And towards the end of this webinar, we'll try and pick them up and get through as many as we can. We also have a feedback form at the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to see that in the description text at the bottom of the screen. And we'd really appreciate it if you would take the time to fill that out after the webinar. Thank you in advance for that. We do look at all the feedback and it helps us build in terms of what we do next. So I'm just going to go through a little background about the SRA. We're the regulatory body of solicitors in England and Wales, and our purpose is to protect the public and the public interest. And through our principles, solicitors do have a duty to act in a way that encourages equality, diversity and inclusion. And one of our goals as an organisation is to make the profession accessible and welcoming to everyone, regardless of their background, so that it reflects the diversity of the public that it serves. And we collect diversity data to monitor the progress of diversity in the profession. And in our most recent data, so this is from 2023, we can certainly see positive trends in terms of entry into the profession, but there's still a significant gap at senior levels for various groups. And especially you see that gap in the largest law firms. And the gap's particularly wide for women and Black, Asian and minority ethnic solicitors. And so to pick out and highlight some of the data, when we look at in 2023, when we look at women who made up 53% of all lawyers in law firms in England and Wales, but women only make up 32% of full equity partners. And you could see that this difference was actually further exaggerated in the largest law firms, and there women are making up just 28% of full equity partners in firms that have more than 50 partners. And then if we look at Black, Asian and minority ethnic lawyers, who are about 20% of the population of lawyers overall, and who make up about 19% of full equity partners. But again, in the larger law firms, there's a difference, and only 8% of full equity partners in the largest law firms are from Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. And so you can see there's lots more of our analysis available, including a breakdown for Welsh firms on our website. And we use research as well as collecting this data. We use research to shine a light on key issues and to help us develop our approach to tackling problems. And this summer, we've published research on the causes of differential outcomes by ethnicity in professional assessments. We'd already done a literature review, and when we've come on to the full research, as expected, that research showed that there's really no single cause for differential outcomes, but instead there is a range of factors, including socioeconomic background, access to legal work experience, and the idea that people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds can feel a lack of belonging within the legal sector. And those findings really help highlight the need for change. Clearly, more needs to be done. And the approach to be taken and being taken by law firms is going to be part of the solution. Firms are starting to think beyond their progressive recruitment practices into how they retain their staff and how they identify and remove barriers to progression for different groups. And one of the recommendations from our research was for law firms to measure retention against appropriate diversity targets at all levels in the firm, and to provide focused mentoring and sponsorship to staff from underrepresented groups. And Ashurst LLP and KPMG LLP are among our largest law firms, and both of our speakers today are going to share from their experience. They're going to share with us the good practice that they've been working on. So now I'm going to turn to you, Megan, and invite you to talk to us and tell us more about the analysis that KPMG has been doing. Megan, thank you.
Thank you so much, and great to be here today. Thank you for having me. Hello to everyone on the call. Yeah, as Eddie mentioned, I thought it'd be helpful today to talk a little bit about some research we published from KPMG in the UK back in 2022 called Mind the Gap. It's publicly available and it's it's on our website, so happy to share the link afterwards if people would like to take a look at it. But I guess as a bit of background, we've got quite a long history as a firm of kind of working on inclusion, diversity and equity. We use the acronym IDE at KPMG for this. I know there's all sorts of different ones floating around, but we use IDE. And historically, a lot of that focused on who's getting into our firm, so widening access to our profession, that kind of different elements and areas of KPMG. But more recently, a lot of what we've started to kind of move our attention to is not just who gets in, but who gets on. So this progression point, who is progressing through our firm. We have the same challenges as most other firms when it comes to senior representation in our leadership, and a lot of kind of work still to do in that space. So progression is a really critical part of that. And actually, I think when you really reflect on it, progression is probably one of your truest indicators of inclusion within a firm, right? Because people's careers matter, and what really happens to them and their experiences day to day in the workplace will be seen through kind of data that links to progression. So we actually first did some work with the Bridge Group. So all this report and our and kind of other work we've done has all been in partnership with the Bridge Group. And we first did some work with them, like I said, in 2018, looking at progression rates. We had all the findings internally, we did some stuff with it, but we didn't publish it. And then in 2022, we decided to refresh the data and see what had changed, like had our gaps improved, got worse, where were we still kind of seeing our biggest challenging areas. And then we published, like I said, this report, which is now the summary of both of those sets of data. So in total, the Bridge Group has analysed for us, I think it's data points from 25,000 KPMG partners and employees over a 10-year time period. So it's a really robust set of data, and there's a lot in there to unpack. And I guess just before we go into the key findings, when we're talking about progression rates, I guess there's all sorts of different ways that you can measure this, but what we have measured for it is the average time taken for our employees to progress through the different grades in our firm. And we've looked at that through a range of IDE kind of characteristics, so socioeconomic background, gender, ethnicity, disability, and sexual orientation. And the analysis tells us where a progression gap exists, i.e. the percentage difference in the average time people are taking to progress from one grade to the next. So if we move on to the key findings and what this has shown us, we've kind of presented on this the progression gaps as at 2022, and then also provided that comparator to 2018 where we had it. I should say we only looked at LGBT plus and disability in our 2022 data set, so there is no comparator there. But if I take us through it bit by bit, so I guess there were a few key findings that jump out. The first and most obvious being that this data tells us that socioeconomic background in our firm has the strongest effect on progression compared to any other diversity characteristic. So those from a lower socioeconomic background appear to take on average 19% longer to progress through our grades compared to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So if we try and contextualize that, if one person is taking on average 5 years, say, to get from one grade to the next, for someone from a low socioeconomic background, that would be an additional year, so more likely 6 years. So over time, that compounded effect is quite large. The progression gaps where you can see between 2018 and 2022, a lot of them did narrow, or in some cases totally reverse. So where we had a negative progression gap, our refresh data showed that that's now in a way kind of swung the other way. So whilst the reduction for SEB, socioeconomic background, was small from 22% to 19%, it was a small reduction in that progression gap. But as you can see, it was much more exaggerated in the ethnicity and gender space. So where we had a historic negative progression gap, we now have a positive progression gap. And I mean that just in the sense of not necessarily it's a better thing, just the numbers swung the other way. Like I said, we don't have any comparator data to see what happened for disability and LGBT plus for a couple of different reasons. But essentially what the 2022 analysis showed us that there didn't appear to be kind of a significant gap for those two areas anyway in the 2022 data set. One of what I think is then probably one of the more interesting parts of the analysis, which isn't actually on a slide, but it is in the report that you can all look at if you're interested, but I will talk to it, is the intersectional data that we then did. Because we had so many data points, and because of the, I guess, generosity of our colleagues to share this data and the hard work that's happened over a long period of time to collect diversity data from our colleagues, we were able to look at this intersectionally and get really quite detailed on it. So not only did our research find that low socioeconomic background was the biggest barrier to progression, but it also showed that when you overlaid socioeconomic background with other characteristics, such as being from an ethnic minority background or identifying as a woman, that effect on your progression became greater and was compounded even further. So we kind of, in a way, managed to rank different groups of colleagues based on intersecting diversity characteristics. So it showed us that actually the groups of colleagues that really are progressing the slowest in our firm are white women from a lower socioeconomic background, Black women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and white men from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And conversely, the groups of colleagues that are progressing the quickest through our firm are Asian men from high socioeconomic backgrounds, Asian women from high socioeconomic backgrounds, and white men from high socioeconomic backgrounds. So there's a lot of really interesting detail that's kind of all in the report for you to read at your leisure if you're interested in doing so. But that intersectional analysis is really powerful and helps uncover kind of what's hidden in these high level stats. I think it's probably then also important to acknowledge that whilst this data is just based on KPMG UK, these findings are not unique to us. And in fact, the Bridge Group has done a number of kind of bits of research with more an industry level, looking at the same thing and finding similar outcomes. So actually in 2020, they did a bit of research with 10 legal firms looking at progression, and that's publicly available too. And that also showed a 15% progression gap for colleagues from a low socioeconomic background versus high socioeconomic backgrounds in terms of making it to partner, and an 8% gap between women and men, and a 17% gap for colleagues from an ethnic minority background versus white colleagues, again, all in terms of making it to partner in law firms. So whilst not a lot of firms might have their own data set on this, I would probably bet good money that we're all facing similar challenges and we're seeing these same trends. So I guess that's the data and that's the big picture. But the thing that's the most interesting part is what's sat behind it. How did we see a reversal of some of our progression gaps? What are we doing to address the ones that we've still got? And I wish I had one answer, but I think like with most things in the IDU space, it was a combination of a number of different things that have happened over a relatively long time period. Some will have had a direct impact, some indirect impacts, and it's all kind of merged together to see some of these changes that we've seen. But that's not particularly helpful for anyone. So to try and pull out, I guess, a few things that I think really have made a difference and that I've noticed in my time at KPMG working in this space, start to kind of move the dial and see the data move, but also kind of the maturity of the conversation the business is having on inclusion. Some of those particular things that I would call out. So programs, inclusion programs, and I know Kalina's going to talk about that a bit later, so I don't want to steal any thunder, but we've had a wealth of different programs run across our business over the years that we're looking at on this, and they really do make a difference. They are leveling the playing field. They're providing kind of formal opportunities where some groups get it informally anyway, without the need for these programs, and just kind of democratizing that. And we know they're a really powerful retention tool, even an attraction tool in some cases. And that also then feeds through in promotion, even if they're not directly kind of promotion programs. And then I think some of the other things that we've done is to really make this, make our leaders accountable for this and improve our own reporting internally. So in that time period of the 2018 to 2022, where we've seen some of these movements, during that time period, we've built in diversity measures across all of our people processes. So we now check all promotions, year-end outcomes, etc., from various inclusion lenses. But we've also taken what used to just be firm-wide targets publicly, but now internally they are more local targets that will build up. So our leaders are really accountable for their progress, and we report that monthly now internally. And that really has driven a step change in how seriously the business take this agenda, and therefore the kind of narrative that and the lead, like how they then lead their own parts of the business, and all those small changes build up to something much bigger. And of course that sits alongside things like our 16 wonderful employee networks, who are in themselves a attraction and retention tool and provide a huge amount of support to our colleagues, and kind of learning programs. We have mandatory inclusion learning that everyone does every 2 years, and all of those pieces, I guess, are coming together into this puzzle. But of course we've still got a lot of work to do. We wouldn't want to see progression gaps either way in any of our areas, and that's the ambition, that's what we're aiming for. And our incredibly stark gap for socioeconomic background is like challenging and something we don't want to be seeing. So there's a couple of kind of bits there's a lot more still to do, essentially, and things that we're still working on to try and address that and close it. But at least we were pleased to see some kind of positive movement, and hopefully if we rerun this data in a few years' time, we'd see a further narrowing across all of those different areas. I'll pause there on running through the data, but really happy to keep taking questions throughout the session. But I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Megan. Thank you so much. I mean, really interesting, and just the insights and the amount of data that you've both been able to share right now with us, but also that I know the depth of data that's in that report and the real value for of being able to use data to then focus minds and focus activities really came through. I'm sure we are going to pick up lots of these themes, and it actually links very neatly, I think, into what Colette's going to talk about. So Colette, I'm going to turn to you, please, and invite you really just to talk us through what Ashurst have been doing. And I know you're going to focus on your parental leave policies and also your programs for Black, Asian and minority ethnic colleagues. Yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aileen, and thank you so much for inviting me to join the discussion today, and everyone for joining. And yeah, I found really insightful what Megan was saying, and actually hearing about just using the data and analysis is critically important. And as you mentioned, I just wanted to bring a couple of priority actions we've taken as well to try and drive our IDB strategy, another acronym. As Megan mentioned, I was using the IDE, IDB, so it's inclusion, diversity, and we focus on belonging as part of our strategy and our conversations. So really, in terms of progression and retention of diverse talent, the first one that I was keen to share with you all is really around our parental leave policy and the enhancements we made to that. So in terms of what we did, so just to take a step back, in July 21 we made this change, and I've put some bullets on there basically to highlight them, but I really want to give you a sense as well of the impact of this work. So it really was, you know, about making this a global policy, global lead, to have that consistency. And it was around increasing obviously the level of leave, so up to 26 weeks fully paid. And what was really important is we took steps then to consult with some of our people networks, particularly Spectrum, which is our LGBT network, the Women's Network, etc. And to really differentiate, this wasn't really about just increasing the leave, but to use things like, you know, gender neutral language in the policy, in the narrative as well. And Megan kindly touched on that around improvement in communications, etc., and sending out these strong signals of inclusion to everybody. But also that there's no distinction between the primary, secondary, or maternity, paternity leave in there as well. And then it went a little bit further in terms of ensuring that fertility treatments were acknowledged, paid leave for those. It was also talking about surrogacy, foster, you know, kinship care as well, and pregnancy loss obviously as well, in terms of, you know, feedback from our people, and leave or recognizing, you know, the variety of leave that was actually taking place in the organization. So where we're at today, actually in February time, we went to the executive team and to the board, having done some analysis of our parental leave, just to really talk about the impact of this. And a few things that were actually seen in here was, one, well, obviously an increased number of people taking parental leave. Of course, that was going to be the case. And, you know, we've heard some brilliant people stories. So as you see at the bottom of this slide, starting to really share sort of stories around, you know, how people feel about taking this leave. And, you know, a number of people working with us have taken 2 parental breaks since this was launched, etc., talk about their partner's experience, etc. But essentially what we're seeing is more an increase in non-birth parents taking leave, and it's mainly men, so more men taking leave. And we think this is fantastic, because it's obviously driving our goal of increasing gender equity across the firm, and it's more inclusive as well, where men feel that they don't have barriers to taking leave as well, and they can make that decision independently themselves as well with their partner. The other part is really around, actually, when we're looking at the talent plan, and I think most of the firms listening to this are talking about talent all the time, how are we really supporting high potential talent, how are we progressing people, how we retain them, etc. And we have our talent, we identify top talent as, you know, those who unleash the extraordinary, and actually for the majority of people who've taken leave have been categorized as unleash extraordinary. So that was proof that it's testament to, we are, you know, retaining our top talent, and they're benefiting from all these things, and actually performance, their sense of inclusion, belonging at the firm is really a key factor. And then the second example I was keen to give us around how we're driving our ethnicity targets. So Aileen, you know, talked about obviously the data that's captured by the SRA, and where representation is in the industry as well. We set you know, aspirational targets for ethnicity and race, particularly for partners, leadership, you know, business services leaders. That's 15% we want to get to by the end of 26, 30% for our legal staff and you know, business services as well by 2026, and having 35% of our trainees be ethnically diverse as well by 2026. Tom, if you're okay to move to the next slide, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. So really, I guess we step back to say, what are we going to do to help our ethnically diverse talent progress and develop, and we retain them in the firm? So last year we started to design a program called Amplify. And to design this program, we invited our people again, our leaders into this. And I mean leaders as in some of the people network leaders, the representatives who are talking about the progress that they want to see, not just at Ashurst, but actually across the sector. And they helped us co-design this program with our facilitators based on what they felt they needed and what we can do to affect that change. So Amplify is the career development program that was attended by ethnically diverse talent in our business. The 2 ways that we went to identify people was we asked them to voluntarily to sign up for the program, because they also might identify themselves as being from an underrepresented group, and it's not just based on the data that we have on the system, but of course we wanted to demonstrate how, if we're capturing data, we're identifying individuals to join the program as well. So that's Amplify. And then Empower, we said, well, we can't just send our people through that without actually giving the leaders, you know, some development as well of how do they manage and, you know, their teams better. How do they understand ethnically diverse talent? How do they build an inclusive team and nurture them as well? So we actually had 120 people who went on this program. It started around the end of November. It finished between the various different cohorts by the end of May. Some finished in June as well, before the holiday period. And where we're at now is not just measuring how many people attended the program, but what were the outcomes? You know, is there an impact on promotions? You know, how do people feel in terms of confidence levels, progression, leaning into their careers, etc. So we're still on a journey with this one, but I thought it's good to start to share what we're doing and continue on that journey, which, as Megan, going back to what Megan said, it's about also using the data now to be able to measure, you know, how people are feeling and how they're progressing their careers. So I'll leave it there, Aileen, if that's okay for now.
That's great, Colette. Thank you. And I think it's great to have the tangible examples, and you know, these examples are always going to be at different phases, aren't they? And you know, the importance of them being able to measure that and understand more, hugely valuable. Thank you. So just to speak more widely to everyone, just to remind you, we do actually have quite a few questions lining up, which I'll get onto in a minute. But if you do have a question, perhaps prompted by what Megan and Colette have been saying, then please do add it in, and we will do our best to get to the questions in a moment. Before I turn to those, I was actually going to just ask a couple of questions. And so Megan, first of all, you know, you took us through and highlighted, you know, the huge value you get, and I understand it completely, from having rich diversity data. And I wondered whether you know, you had any top tips for firms who might be actually struggling to increase their diversity data declaration rates, and any tips about what they could do to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would say that, like, we're still on a journey with that as well. We, for context, so we have about 85% declared across most of our diversity questions. It is slightly lower for socioeconomic background because they're slightly newer questions. That sits at around 75%, but just as a bit of context. So we still have a gap to close, and it's something we look at. We run a campaign every year. We've done that for at least the whole time I've been in the firm. And I think we've learned different things each time, and kind of each one's been with varying degrees of success. So I think some of the main lessons we've learned is to really understand the different groups of people that you're kind of asking of. So at a really basic level, obviously at KPMG, we have many different parts. We have our audit practice, consulting, legal practice, etc. That all of our business areas respond really differently to different types of campaigns. And that's been really interesting, where we take more of a compliance-based approach in our comms. We get better uptake in some areas of our business, and in others we get a better uptake when we do more of a kind of a hearts and minds capturing. And so different things will work for different people. So understanding what your firm responds to is kind of the first step. And I guess kind of as part of that, understanding who might not have declared. So we have a real issue with new joiners. We do build this in for our new joiner kind of training, but that's a really overwhelming time, isn't it, when you start a new job and you're bombarded with so much information. And we do see kind of higher levels of incomplete profiles for our new joiner population than we do for and then at the other end, we've got people who've been at KPMG a really, really, really long time, who did it when they first joined, and the questions have updated and they've just not gone back in to check when we've added new questions. So where you have got something that you've started, where you started collecting diversity data, having a look at where your gaps are will probably tell you quite a lot about what approach you can take to complete it. And then I think the things that we've always kind of the principles we've held to in all our campaigns and kind of pushes on ITU data sharing is being really, really clear on what we ask, why we ask it, how we protect it, how it's used, And then most importantly is that feedback loop. So we're going to ask you to share this personal information with us. We're going to ask you to trust us to use it in the right way. And then we're going to show you what that's led to. So things like this progression report, and then kind of the actions and initiatives that have come off the back of it, being just really clear in our comms that this is only the direct result of you all taking the time to kindly share that information with us, and we take that really seriously. So yeah, I think it's kind of, it depends on what your business responds to. Some of our business areas respond really well to like competition, like leaderboards of who's got the most declaration, kind of like mini pushes around that. Yeah, different teams will respond differently, and I guess trying different things, you'll learn a lot as you go, but it's definitely a long slog. And I feel like the final kind of 15-20% from our experience is like the hardest nut to crack, because you've got through the people who are willing to do it, want to do it, and you're left with kind of colleagues who either don't want to, which is absolutely fine, explaining that prefer not to say is still a declaration, and that's still, you know, that's an option you can use, but it's always that kind of final yard that presents us with the greatest challenge. So I'm open for tips too, if anyone has any. Please share them.
Yeah, no, that's great, and those are great tips to share. So thank you for that. And Colette, I had a question in my mind for you as well. Just again, over your years of working in retention and progression, focused on diverse groups, whether you had kind of one key lesson that you'd like to share from that experience.
Yeah, I think I think from an employer perspective, I think the one part is making sure, and Megan has touched on this as well, is sharing people, demonstrating, if we're asking for something, demonstrating what we're doing with it. And I think we have to continue to show the impact of what our work is actually doing. So the parental leave, etc., talking about that, and actually encouraging leaders to speak about it, the people networks as well, and also valuing their input into these things like co-designing programs, or input into policies, etc. Just really showing why that collaboration really matters. But the impact of the work is really important.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so what I'm going to do, thank you, is go to some of the questions that we've received from our audience. And actually, I'll put this first one to both of you. And it's a question about how can workplaces ensure that women and those from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background have the tools to combat imposter syndrome. Megan, should I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. I think imposter syndrome, I think, is always really interesting whenever we think about it, because 100% certain groups will feel it, maybe more professionally than others, but it's a pretty universal, I think, kind of human experience to have at some point in your life. And so I think the first thing is recognizing that it's okay. Often the questions will be kind of, how do we overcome it? How do we get past it? And maybe you never will, maybe you will. Everyone's kind of different, but the first probably just acknowledging it's totally normal. And I think therefore role models is what's so critical, having very successful people sharing that they sometimes feel it too, or they still do, or they used to, kind of whatever their experience has been. And even like, personally being really mindful of like what content I take in on things like social media, who I'm following, how authentic they are, podcasts, like How to Fail podcast, just hearing from people that all these things are normal, and therefore the feelings associated with it are normal. And I think from a workplace perspective, this is where, like I say, role models, but also kind of coaches, mentors, sponsors, they make such a difference. And interesting, we had one colleague who themselves became a mentor through one of our programs, that they volunteered their time to do it, and they said that being a mentor to someone more junior in their career actually helped them overcome their own feelings to some extent of imposter syndrome, because it was partly paying it forward, having open conversations, but also just actually recognizing the value that they did have, and the kind of what they could bring and to support someone else. So yeah, I guess a couple of things. I don't have kind of a perfect solution, but all of those things we've seen definitely help people at an individual level.
Yeah, really useful, helpful insights. Colette, did you want to add some?
Yeah, well, yeah, everything Megan said was just absolutely brilliant. And I think, yeah, exactly what Megan said in terms of role modeling, what it looks like. But I think now we're trying to obviously focus in on different identities or backgrounds. So, making sure we have really good examples of how that might actually show up. If you're from a lower socioeconomic background, so the role models, mentors, as Megan said, from the same identities are really important to help with some of that. Or women, I think it's shown up a lot more. Menopause, we think about the demographics, age demographics, gender, really trying to use that as much knowledge and experience that we have and storytelling from others to help us understand how that is going to show up. And then what do we do in those situations when it happens? Really code switching. So it could be accents, it could be our backgrounds. It's trying to help people understand how it shows up, but actually how do they spot the signs, how do they overcome it, and how, from a belonging perspective, if we want to create a sense of belonging, it's enabling people to be themselves in the workplace. It's not about just fitting in to how everyone else works. It's actually being their true self and valuing those strengths as well.
Thank you. Really great insights from both of you, and thank you. A really great question to kick us off as well. So I have another question here, and this is from someone who speaks English as a second language, and they've been getting a kind of consistent message from their firm, kind of setting them an objective of improving their English as something, to help their career progression. So I was going to come to both of you probably. Actually, I will come to Colette first, please. But and the question here is really about whether you have any thoughts on how this person could approach this with their employer, or perhaps any insights or tangible things that you have in place in your firms to support staff who have English as their second language, and feeling that it's potentially a barrier to their career progression. Colette?
Yeah, I think firstly, just hearing that, I mean, you have that slight reaction to it where you think, if you're getting that feedback constantly, what does it do to the person? Is that, going back to the imposter syndrome question, how does that start to raise that confidence, or deteriorate sort of in terms of you feeling confident about your language skills? So I think firstly, if the individual is asked this question, if they feel that their level of English, given as their second language as well, and are learning to improve that constantly, particularly in our world in legal, and we know obviously there's lots of focus on language and getting that right, contracts, etc. But I think it's probably worth, if at this stage they feel that it is having an impact on them, then they should speak to the person who's giving them the feedback and have that conversation. Yeah, I know it's difficult, but try and have that conversation with them to help them understand how it's making you feel as well. Because if it's not something fundamentally wrong with how they're delivering a message, or they're not having making errors in their work, etc., then I mean that's the most crucial thing. If there's errors or something coming up, it's how do you learn from those things. But if it's not about that, it's just how you're speaking to someone and maybe you're getting some words wrong, or your accent is playing through or something, I think you have to feel sort of comfortable to have the conversation. From a belonging perspective, again, that's the part that makes me feel sort of uncomfortable with it, is how it's having an impact on someone to help them feel like they belong. But start with that approach. But I can imagine if it progresses, unfortunately, it can get to a situation where the person's feeling that they don't fit in there, and it has a knock-on effect on confidence, performance, etc., etc.
Yeah. And Megan, did you want to add anything on that one?
No, I mean, that was a brilliant answer, and a lot. I kind of totally agree with everything said, but I think from maybe a firm perspective, it just prompted something we've done quite recently. Is our most recent version of our mandatory inclusion learning. We put on it like the wheel of privilege and all different areas and kind of the different levels of privilege associated with different parts of our identity, and one of them was about English being someone's first language versus second language. And so more just kind of from what firms could do to support, or since putting that in the mandatory learning, the amount of feedback we've had from colleagues just going like, that was really, really fascinating. Like, it really made people stop and reflect. It's just, I think often maybe other people will take it, if English is their first language, for granted, just how difficult it is to do to work or to do anything in a second language, frankly, but never mind to work in a professional role like this. So helping just highlight and get people thinking about it may also, from a firm perspective, lessen this particular individual circumstance, but just kind of open up that conversation and just get people reflecting on it, really.
Yeah, that's great. We've got quite a few other questions, so I'm going to try and get through as many as we can. Megan, I might just ask this one of you, primarily time-wise, but
Yes.
a question about retention metrics and which ones that you're actually looking at and how you track retention between different diversity groups. So I think it's a bit more of what you were saying earlier, but just a bit more detail on that. People are keen to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess with retention, we probably measure it a few different ways. So we will directly measure who is still with the firm when we're looking at things like our high performing talent and how that cuts by different diversity groups, but also through some of the programs that we'll put people on, how many are still with the firm X number of years later. But then, of course, conversely, we're also then able to measure attrition. So who are we disproportionately losing at certain grades and from certain diversity groups. And then one other thing I would just mention, because I know, sorry, we've got a lot of questions, but in our people survey, our global people survey, we recently introduced a question on intention to stay. So it was not a direct measure of who's actually here or who's left, but what people are feeling about their longevity of their career at our firm, which is really interesting. It just throws up a whole load of conversations on how long do we want people to stay? What's a good outcome on here? Like career mobility. But it's kind of a bit of a future check for us on retention as well.
Great, thank you. So hope I can get through another couple. There's a question here basically asking what can be done to ensure that and this is the intersectionality point as well, but that women with a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background and with disabilities, and what can be done to enable them to progress their legal careers at all levels without facing barriers. Colette, could I ask for your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the intersectionality, obviously Megan touched on as well in terms of the analysis and what that was drawn out. I think firstly, you're always constantly unpacking it to what can be the challenges for a woman, and then ethnicity, and then disability. And you have to start making the steps around recognizing all of those identities. Some of them are about, confidence, showing up, making sure, we're putting in some of the development, mentoring type steps as well. But disability is also about accessibility and what is actually needed to do your job as well in terms of technology, technology support as well, that the adjustments that need to be made in the workplace to enable that. So there's a number of things that need to be done. It won't be just one action, but it's helping the person to unpack some of those things as well so that we can help them in terms of the steps that they take, but the leaders as well in recognizing all of those things and how they will manifest it essentially during the day for that individual.
Yeah. So I might just go to one of the other questions here, which was really a very general one, but how to get hold of the reports and the information that you've been talking about today. Megan and then Colette, perhaps you could just explain how people can see this information.
Yes, absolutely. So our Mind the Gap report is available on our impact site, so KPMG UK's impact site on the inclusion section. But equally, I'm happy to offline work with the relevant teams behind the scenes to make sure I share the links to that, plus the legal sector bridge group report I referenced as well, to get that out to anyone who joined. That's
great. We'll make sure that's there. And Colette, is there anything that you would signpost people to?
Yeah, we haven't published the report. We will, of course, refer to work we're doing in our annual sustainability report, action plan, etc. Of course, we want to make sure we're communicating the policy in the best possible way on our career sites to suppliers, etc. And in terms of the ethnicity program, happy if people want to reach out and just ask some questions about the approach that we took. That's absolutely fine. We're doing exactly the same with some of our clients as well, just sharing some of the work. It may not be the best, like the one solution is going to fix everything, but I think where we can continue sharing one another what we're doing, that really helps us get to a place where something's going to work effectively.
Yeah, that's really kind. And just to mention, the SRA diversity data that we collect is also available on our website. And I think it was the other point that was made very early on, I think by Megan, about, there is a real richness of information out there. And I think, some of the value of being able to share and compare and contrast, shouldn't be lost. Look, I'm conscious we've got about a minute left. I just wanted to turn to you, Megan and Colette, for just your last word, a quick takeaway from the topics that we've been talking about today. Megan.
Yeah, I guess my kind of overriding takeaway on events like this is that all of these issues we're facing are greater than any single person or firm. And so there's power in all of us coming together and sharing what we're learning and kind of helping each other out. So I'm always an open door, always wanting to discuss, hear from other firms. And yeah, there's power in this group, so we should use it to kind of make a greater impact.
Right, Colette.
Completely support what Megan has said, and I recognise being at a smaller firm, you might be one person doing this role, or you're in HR and trying to do the D&I role essentially as part of that. So don't feel like you're on your own. Definitely collaborate, and as Megan said, the strength in numbers, but keep collaborating, sharing best practice, and we will at least move forward in a positive way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Megan and Colette. Thank you very much for those insights, and I think really quite inspiring messages. We really appreciate it, and thank you for giving up your time today. And thank you very much to the wider audience, and thank you so much for the questions, and apologies that we didn't quite get through all of them. We will certainly pick up the themes going forward, so we really appreciate your engagement. I hope everyone has found this as insightful and useful as I have. Please do remember we have that feedback form. We do want to know what you think, and if there's any other topics that you'd find useful for us to cover in webinars such as this in the future, please do let us know. But thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.